Okay, let's unpack this. The source material today is, it's not just analysis. It's the official chronicle of a geostrategic earthquake. The execution of Operation Absolute Resolve on January 3rd, 2026. We are diving deep into this stunning U.S. military intervention, the one that resulted in the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores right there in Caracas. This action is, by every measure, the most significant U.S. military operation in Latin America
since the 1989 invasion of Panama.
Absolutely. And our mission for you, the listener, is critical today. This deep dive has to go far beyond the military success itself. We need to dissect the profound challenge this presents to the entire foundation of the international rules-based order. We're going to look at why it happened, the military how, and what the immediate fallout is for everyone, especially G7 partners.
Right, because they're scrambling right now.
They are.
That context is essential. So before we get to the raid itself, we really have to understand the, 27-year trajectory that made this even conceivable. This didn't just happen overnight. Not at all. It was a slow burn, and the sources point to three big drivers, starting all the way back in 1999. The first one is really ideology and just baked-in mistrust. When Hugo Chavez launched the Bolivarian Revolution, Venezuela immediately went from being a U.S. partner to, well, the vanguard of regional anti-imperialism.
And that 2002 coup attempt was the real turning point, wasn't it?
It was the point of no return. Caracas always blamed Washington for orchestrating it, and that just created a permanent rupture.
And that political rupture quickly becomes an economic one. That's the second driver, right? Energy and resource nationalism.
Exactly. In 2007, Venezuela nationalized its oil assets, kicking out American giants like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. That wasn't just policy, it was a geopolitical statement.
A very loud one.
A very loud one. And they used those massive oil reserves to build new alliances. Infrastructure deals with China, military cooperation with Russia, energy diplomacy with Iran. It gave the regime a lifeline against Western sanctions for years.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and I think this is what changes the legal game. The third driver. This criminalization framework. U.S. policy didn't just treat Maduro as a political opponent. The strategy shifted to redefine the entire Venezuelan state as a narco state, a mafia state.
Precisely. And that was the legal scaffolding they needed for what was to come. It was meticulously laid out. You see it first with the March 2020 indictments, charging a sitting head of state, Maduro, with narco-terrorism.
Then the disputed 2024 election gave them the moral justification, basically saying the regime had no legitimacy left.
And the final piece, the real trigger, came in late 2025. The designation of the Cartel of the Suns, implicating the government's top brass and the Tren de Aragua gang as terrorist organizations.
That was it. That's the moment counter-narcotics stops being a police problem and becomes a military objective.
Under the banner of national security.
So if we look at that short escalation timeline, you can see the buildup happening in plain sight. It starts in August 2025. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Group moves into the Southern Caribbean. A huge signal.
And that flows right into Operation Southern Spear, a big ramp-up in maritime interdictions, over 115 people killed in these operations by early January. This was the opening salvo.
Then the naval quarantine, seizing oil tankers, and finally, December 29th. The CIA acknowledges a land-based strike on a narcotic stock.
So in just 5 months, you go from peacetime deterrence to active military enforcement.
Which brings us right to January 3rd, 2:00 a.m. local time, Operation Absolute Resolve.
And the source material details a classic, what they call a leadership decapitation strategy, all about speed, precision, and minimizing collateral damage.
They used a huge force package, something like 150 aircraft. You're talking F-22s and F-35s for air dominance, B-1 bombers for precision strikes, and then Apaches for the ground phase.
And look at the targets. 7 major explosions across Caracas, hitting Fuerte Tiuna, the military HQ, La Guaira port, telecom hubs. But and this is key, they deliberately avoided the core oil infrastructure.
That part is fascinating. It's like they wanted to blind the regime, not break the country's economic back.
Surgically precise. And the extraction itself, elite Delta Force operators. They took Maduro and Celia Flores from their residence, even took some ground fire. The sources say it points to exceptional operational security and intelligence dominance.
Or, as the sources also suggest, insider facilitation. I mean, doesn't that make more sense? Why keep a $50 million reward active right up until the raid if your intelligence is already perfect?
That is the big question. It strongly suggests they leveraged corruption within the regime to guarantee success. And that's the thing. The operation was a tactical marvel, no question. But that tactical success hasn't translated into strategic political success. You have decapitation, but not regime change.
So you take out the head, but the body, the whole state apparatus, is still functioning. Why didn't it collapse?
Because the core power brokers are all still in place. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez immediately declared herself acting president, and crucially, Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez still has the loyalty of the FANB, the armed forces.
So everything really hinges on the military, on the FAMB. Are there any signs they might fracture?
The early indicators are a clear no. Cohesion is holding. And there are, well, a few strong reasons for that. First, senior officers have huge economic interests tied to the regime.
Right.
Second, many of them face U.S. indictments themselves, so a transition could mean extradition. And third, foreign aggression tends to unify people. They see themselves as guarantors of the revolution against an imperial enemy.
That's a political minefield.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pivot to the global norms. What does this massive unilateral action mean for the whole international system? Officials are calling it the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
It's a seismic shift. It really is. It puts forward this idea of conditional sovereignty.
Explain that. What does that mean in practice?
It means that a state's sovereignty, that bedrock principle of non-interference, is now apparently conditional on its compliance with U.S.-defined standards, on counter-narcotics, migration, protecting U.S. economic interests. It's a profound departure from, centuries of international law.
And the other piece is using criminal law as a justification for war. By framing Maduro's government as a cartel, they just sidestepped all the usual rules about using military force against another country.
They completely blurred the line between law enforcement and warfare, which brings the international legal assessment front and center. The operation appears to violate multiple UN charter provisions, Article 2.4, which prohibits using force against another state's territory, and Article 51, which says the only justification is self-defense.
Which the U.S. hasn't claimed.
No. And it also violates customary international law, maybe most significantly, the absolute immunity for sitting heads of state.
Let's pause on that. The sources use the term ratione personae. For everyone listening, that's basically the idea that a head of state is untouchable while in office, no matter the allegations. And this action just dismantled that.
Completely. It undermines the entire diplomatic structure that has governed things since World War II. If this is accepted, it legitimizes unilateral military enforcement of domestic law by any state.
The dangerous precedent, then, is truly global.
Think about it. Russia could use this logic against Ukrainian leaders. China could use it against Taiwanese officials. It signals a move toward a might makes right world order.
Which connects directly to the immediate fallout. Let's start with migration. Colombia is already deploying security forces, expecting another surge of refugees. And the numbers are just staggering. Over 7.7 million Venezuelans, that's 20% of the population, have already fled since 2014. Another wave could break the region.
And the global reaction is fracturing along predictable lines. In Latin America, you have Brazil's Lula calling it an unacceptable line, while Argentina's Milei is celebrating, saying, freedom advances.
Adversaries were quick to condemn. China, with its 50 to 60 billion in oil investments, called it hegemonic behavior. Russia is, of course, offering to mediate.
But the real dilemma is with the G7, with our European partners. They agree Maduro is illegitimate, but they cannot endorse these unilateral military means.
So it creates a huge transatlantic rift.
A huge one. And they fear this Putinization effect, that Moscow will just use the U.S. justification to reinforce its own actions in Ukraine.
So why should you, listening at home, care about Venezuelan oil? You might think its current output is too low to matter.
And you'd be right. In the short term. But the political risk is what matters now. Venezuela has those 303 billion barrels, the world's largest reserves, but production is down 70% from its peak.
And the infrastructure is a mess. I saw the source estimates it needs over $58 billion in maybe a decade to get back to peak production.
That's right. So the massive economic payoff President Trump promised is, well, it's at least a decade away, even in a best-case scenario. The near-term supply disruption is limited simply because Venezuela's output was already so low.
Okay, let's shift to the future. The source lays out 4 possible paths, but the probabilities are pretty grim. The best case, a rapid democratic transition, is only given a 15% chance.
Very unlikely. And the worst case, civil conflict and state collapse, is at 20%. That means millions more refugees and the U.S. trapped in a quagmire.
So what's the most likely outcome we should be preparing for?
The most likely is scenario 3, a de facto U.S. protectorate. It has a 35% probability. And the trigger is basically President Trump's assertion that the U.S. would, quote, run the country.
And what does a protectorate actually look like on the ground?
It means the FANB remains passively resistant, not cooperating, but not collapsing. The opposition is too fragmented to govern, so the U.S. has to step in, establish a provisional authority, manage key sectors like oil.
So you have no real democratic legitimacy.
None. And you get intense regional resentment, while Venezuelan sovereignty is basically subordinated to U.S. goals.
Given that outcome, the source recommends G7 partners adopt a policy of conditional engagement, a kind of principled pragmatism.
It's a tightrope walk. They have to issue a statement condemning the unilateral action, drawing a line on the means, but at the same time offer billions in aid, maybe 25 to 30 billion. That is strictly contingent on a monitored democratic transition.
It's an attempt to regain some influence without completely blowing up the alliance.
Exactly.
History shows us that tactical military success, like we saw in Iraq in 2003 or even Panama in '89, it rarely guarantees strategic political success. In 3 of the 4 scenarios here, Venezuelan suffering continues or gets worse.
And this deep dive really forces us to confront that core issue. Can the rules-based order actually survive selective application? If powerful states apply the rules to their adversaries but exempt themselves, the whole system just collapses.
The G7's response in these next few weeks isn't just about Venezuela. It's about signaling whether the foundational rules of international conduct even apply anymore.
And that's the provocative thought we'll leave you with today. If the U.S. criminalizes governance and uses its military to enforce domestic law against another sovereign nation, what stops China from using that exact same logic against officials in Taiwan, or Russia against officials in Ukraine? What global conflict is made exponentially more likely by the normalization of this specific legal justification?